We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Great to have you on today. We'll dive straight into it. What's the feeling like right now in America with Trump's impending inauguration? It seems overwhelmingly positive. Is that the feeling that
Yeah,
we're getting?
yeah. I mean, great question. There's a huge sense of optimism in the U.S. right now. I'm not suggesting everybody, and they're going to be the sort of reliable progressive Democrats that I'm sure are upset and probably not talking about it very much. But yeah, there's a real sense of optimism. I mean, even over Thanksgiving, which is late November, in I was in New York and there were kids, teenage boys wearing MAGA hats, and I've got friends that were in California for Christmas and said even California is just hopping with optimism. So it's really a good feeling.
Wow, you wouldn't expect California to have that kind of Trump to have that
Yeah,
kind of response.
yeah,
Uh,
it's
it,
easy. It's easy to assume that, but it used to be a Republican state, but then,
right.
but what we're finding is even in the blue states like California, so many more people voted for Trump this time than in 2016 or 20, and
Right.
so there are a significant number of people that
It'd
are,
be we'll
but
definitely dive into why Trump's vote share increased and why he
yeah,
was as popular as he is.
yeah,
But going back to the sort of inauguration and what's going on since he's won the election, it seems as almost as if he's already started his presidency.
yeah,
It seems to be very in the news and
yeah,
talking to senior leaders. What exactly is going on there? Because for a lot of UK listeners, they weren't. We're
yeah,
known to normally see. Normally, there's this sort of period, this transition period, then the president
sure.
starts. But it seems in this case it started earlier.
Yeah, it definitely has. You make a really good point, and what we found, there's a few reasons for that. One is, it is a pretty long, inauguration process, right? It's, from November, it's 2.5 months basically, and that seems like a lot of time to people in other countries. There's a bit of history and tradition here. It was originally designed that way because back in the day before railroads, it took weeks for the president to get from, even New England or the South to Washington because they were traveling by horse. And then, after railroads in the 1860s, let's say, you had a faster transportation. But, so there's just a little history there, and I think there's some merit to sticking with it. And that's just always been the case. The second thing is, President Trump is much, yes, fired up, really optimistic and aggressive. And that's different from 2016, where I think many of us, including maybe President Trump himself, were surprised that he won. It's not that he thought he had no chance. So he did have a transition team in place, but it wasn't, 100% optimistic during the election cycle. So I don't think people were as aggressive. There weren't a lot of people raising their hands for positions in the administration because it just looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win. And then he did have some difficulty because he was new to Washington. It's amazing. He'd only been there a handful of times prior to winning the election. He'd never spent a night in Washington because as you know, New York and Washington are close enough where you can really just do a day trip. You don't really need to stay over. And so he was new to that town, and Chris Christie, who ended up being a vocal and pretty critical opponent of Trump later, he was the transition manager or transition leader, and and they ended up having a falling out, and he fired Chris Christie in early January of 2017. So it was just a real mess, and it just everything got started slowly or too late with the transition, whereas this time he was very much ready because he knew he was going to win. And the third point there is Biden is incredibly weak. I mean, he's checked out, mentally years ago. I mean, he's had cognitive issues his entire term. He had, so-called good days and bad days, but I think he's having more bad days now. But he is really, such a weak president that it's just natural that the incumbent is going to Now, I wouldn't even say take advantage of it. I think it's necessary. People can't wait for January 20th.
Definitely, that's I think the feeling in the UK and across the globe. It seems like it's we're almost just waiting, and it's almost like he's already assumed the role. But I
Yeah,
want to get back to that in that interesting point about Trump this term and how much more ready he is this time than
yeah,
2016. I think one of the things that from the people I speak to, of the young, maybe people on the left or right, I think the thing that most people are really excited about his is administration. It seems a lot more cohesive. It seems like he's got his people
yeah.
in the positions, whereas I think 2016 maybe is different. Is that fair to say in terms of your Elons,
Well,
Tulsi Gabbard's,
yeah.
RFK? It
I
seems
mean,
like it's amazing.
without a doubt, that's the case, Sunil. I mean, last time again, he was new to Washington, so he had to pick establishment people. How else could you run the government or run the country? So he had to just, sort of he didn't have that team in place like most presidents do. But most presidents, if they're governors, Barack Obama brought his Chicago team, Reagan, of course, with the California crew. George W. Bush was governor of Texas, the second or third largest state in the U.S. So, they had people in place. Trump really didn't have much of that except for maybe his campaign staff. So, he wasn't really prepared, and he brought in people that he thought would be good, and he was wrong. They were establishment people, and he was very much an anti-establishment person. But now he's had 8 years, his term and then his term out of office, to put together the team to go back to the people who made it through, Trump 1.0, and have stuck with them. And so there's just a lot more synergy. There's a lot more, sort of team orientation with the crew he's got assembled now. And again, we also were very confident that he was going to win. I didn't call it with 100% certainty, but he was polling much better than he did in 16 and 20. So even polls that had it tied, kind of indicated or suggested that he would win. So yeah, there's a lot more energy. I think there's a lot more understanding of the way he governs and the people he wants to put together. And it's not just yes men. I see some of this, criticism on the left. They're just all Trump loyalists. And I don't think that's the case. I think you have people that have had friction, personal friction or political friction with President Trump in the past, like Marco Rubio. You've got people who are willing to say no. Elon Musk is one of them. He's not just a Trump apologist. He's disagreed with President Trump on issues in the last 2 months since the election, and that's good. That's good to have disagreement. It's good to have some pushback and some sounding boards. So yeah, it feels like a real much more positive situation this time.
Well, even RFK, at one point was running against as an
Yeah,
independent. You got Elon Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democrat who's been very critical
sure.
of Trump in the past. So it seems like a really, from whoever I speak to in America, it just seems people with tradition on the left,
Yeah,
everyone seems very optimistic. Seems like a really good, a good moment for America.
yeah,
What's the feeling like in terms of the Trump world stage? I can only speak on maybe a bit on UK in terms of the
yeah,
shedding light to a lot of serious issues in the UK, and I've heard yourself talk about on GB News how you think he's the Trump winning is almost like a victory, not just for USA but for the West.
yeah.
If you touch a bit more on that, that'd be
Sure.
good to get the input.
Absolutely. Look, there's a couple of things working here. One is, Trump is definitely a leader, and I think he sees himself not only as leading the U.S. but leading the West, and that's the traditional role for American presidents. We haven't had that for 4 years, so I think you have again a return to optimism. But also, if you look at the political trends in Europe and even in Canada right now, it's the electorates are moving to the right. So it's very good timing with President Trump winning. So I think a lot of people, a lot of voters are looking at America and saying, they can do it, so can we. And this is a common sense. It's not just right leaning, it's common sense. People are just fed up with big government telling them they can't burn certain kind of fuel in their to provide heat for their house. They can't use certain kind of energy to cook. It's just common sense. People are really fed up with it. And of course, the big issues like inflation and illegal immigration, those were the top two in the US election. that's a pretty common theme throughout the West right now. So yeah, I think it's partly that, the return of a powerful leader is a good thing, but also you have the political winds blowing in President Trump's direction.
Do you think almost Trump has created some of those own wins? Because
Yeah,
it seems like, a lot in the UK and in just general Europe, there hasn't really been a lot of movement from the right in general. I think it's been a lot of the right's been diluted, if you like. We had
yeah,
a conservative government for such a long period, and people started towards saying so they were almost the same as the Labour Party
yeah.
and left traditional in the UK. So do you think Trump has almost started this, like this kind of this more
Oh,
movement?
yeah, he's definitely a part of it, right? And I think so. There's always that argument, what's first, the chicken or the egg? Is that Trump is taking advantage of the political winds changing toward the right, or is he leading the charge? I think it's probably a little bit of both. But yeah, I think people were really excited that he won. I'm not saying the great majority of voters, right? He still polls, unfavorably in Europe, but I do think that the numbers have changed to his benefit in terms of polling. But look at what's happened. I think it's not just traditional conservatism. I think people from the left even are just fed up with sort of the top down government style, and that's what happened to the Tories. I think the rejection of the Tories was pretty consistent with the rejection of establishment center left and center right parties throughout Europe. And I wouldn't even consider, I'm being kind to say they were center right. They really governed from the left. If you think about the things that I know that's not the topic today, but I'll just kind of run through it quickly. Look at what Boris and Rishi accomplished: price caps, windfall taxes, price controls, fracking ban, things that Joe Biden could only dream of. So I think, that's why you see the Reform Party doing so well, and other parties in Europe that are taking advantage of the change in people's views.
That's a good point to talk about in terms of President Trump's viewing of the UK, because it's a bit of almost a concern with the current administration, particularly with Labour.
Sure.
They've got a cabinet of people who have said some pretty nasty things towards Trump over the last 8 years or so. What's the feeling in America towards just generally the UK, what's going on in the UK in general? And then secondly, how do you see that relationship between the US and UK developing when Trump is inaugurated?
Yeah, I mean, first things first. President Trump loves the UK. The things were so much better when he was in office, and then followed by President Biden, who on many occasions, in some ways, disrespected the UK, or at the very least didn't pay much attention to them. Also favored the EU, favored Ireland in any kind of discussions. So, I think there's a return to the special relationship that we haven't had for 4 years. On the other hand, you do have a Labor government, and I think it's going to be up to them to reach out to President Trump. As you know, he's got a great relationship with Nigel Farage, and I think that the reform relationship is going to be important because that's the best connectivity for now. And you're right, they did, so many of the Labor government people, said such nasty things. It's one thing to disagree with your political opponents or argue for one policy over the other, but to call someone a racist and a fascist and a white nationalist, those are really horrible things to say. And so I think if it's going to be up to Labor to reach out and to try to mend fences, I think they can. And I think President Trump would be, happy to do that. In the meantime, it's not like there won't be any connectivity. You have this relationship with Reform and Nigel Farage, and also you have Elon Musk, throwing a grenade in the room in the last few days. And I think so. To answer your question, the sentiment toward the UK in the last few days is probably pretty negative because that story had not really hit the press, of the rape gangs, and so that really wasn't a topic in the U.S. and now it is, and in conservative media and mainstream media even. So, that's just a speed bump, though. I think, there will be some things that'll be considered provocative or aggressive, but I think the best thing that the Labor government could do is to cooperate and follow his lead. The security and defense relationship, there should never be a speed bump there. And so I think that, there will be good things that come out of this relationship in the next 4 years.
I think it's hard at the moment to avoid not talking about the grooming gangs, the
Yeah.
green rape gangs and stuff. What's going on? What's that? What impact has that had in America? We're seeing, Elon talk about it a lot. We're seeing other American politicians speak about it a lot. What impact has had the grooming gang scandal in the UK? What impact has that had in America? And has that changed? Has America's opinion of UK changed from that?
Yeah, look, I think it would be impossible to say long term. This is only a few days into it, and I think there's just real surprise and shock from the U.S. about this. Like, how could these things happen? And it also is going to connect to the conversations that people are having about immigration, and assimilation, and so these are not topics that are unusual in the U.S. I mean, we are having those conversations, and I think much of the discussion about the open border, which Biden, created and really, on purpose. I mean, it was his intention to open the border, and he did it, and without thinking about, the repercussions and so I think a lot of the conversation around the open border issue in America was on sex trafficking gangs, human trafficking gangs, drug trafficking gangs that were coming across the border at their leisure, and that was a big topic. So it's not a foreign topic to the U.S. It's just that they hadn't seen that the cover, it's always the cover up that can sometimes be worse than the crime. In this case, the crime was so horrible that I wouldn't make that argument this time. But I do think that the cover up is a big issue, and I think that the fear of politicians and the media of being labeled as racist is just a classic example of like wokeism gone too far, and it went too far in many of these places, and you're seeing the rejection of DEI now. A lot of the big companies, HSBC just fired their DEI person. The big American banks dropped it over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks. McDonald's yesterday. So the big corporates who are really afraid of the public for so many years are just finding how absurd it is, and how honest conversation is so much better than political correctness and the cancel culture. So I think it's refreshing, that and but it's not a foreign topic to Americans at all.
I think this is a really good point in terms of big companies rejecting sort of wokeism and DEI. And again, I think President Trump has a massive role to play. And it seems like a lot of these companies have made that decision following his election. And
Yeah,
what's really interesting, I'm sure it's been covered quite extensively in America, is Mark Zuckerberg yesterday in terms
yeah,
of his news on Facebook. What's the reaction been like in the States on that? Has that made Mark Zuckerberg a bit more popular, or what's the
yeah.
general sentiment?
Look, I think, of course, if you're on the right, you're saying that's great news. He made the right decision. If you're on the left, you're saying he's abandoned, the left, and abandoned his principles or whatever. Look, I don't think it's that dramatic. This is capitalism. Companies have to do what's best for their shareholders, and they abandon that with a lot of this insanity with the DEI and all the things that went with it. And I think, and same with the ESG movement. And so I think that this is a good move, not because he's choosing, choosing people on the right to be in leadership positions. That's good news. That's just natural. When an administration changes, it's natural that your government relations people should be people that are well entrenched or well connected in Washington. So that's just good business. But I do think it's a refreshing end to censorship and this obsession with wokeism on the left, but not just on the left, in the institutions and big corporates, of course, the universities, the media. And as you know, it all started with something that wasn't true, which was the death of George Floyd. While tragic and obviously mistakes were made, but they started talking about this epidemic of unarmed black men being killed by white police officers, which was a complete and utter fabrication and statistically proven. and it just didn't occur. It's not a thing. And so somehow the media made it a thing, and then the corporates felt compelled to pile on and start all this DEI insanity. And I think many sensible people, maybe not on the far progressive left, but many sensible Democrats are just really relieved that this stuff is coming to an end. I'm not saying it's over, but it's definitely looking that way.
I definitely want to touch on a bit later on what the futures for the Democrats and what you
Yeah.
see on that. But going on to the DEI and all of that sort of George Floyd, obviously that a lot of it got imported here in the
Yeah.
UK,
Good.
and unfortunately, and it became a really topical thing, and is arguably still something that goes on in the UK. Um, in relation to the Trump victory, I mean, the criticism I've seen from Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook is had Kamala Harris won the election, and he may not have done what he's come out and done. Is there some? Do you think there's some truth behind
I,
that?
I think there's some truth. I think, he perhaps wouldn't have changed his government relations and communications people like he did in such a dramatic way. And again, that's just business, right? So yes, if she won, you'd probably have Nick Clegg still in business. But I don't think it's 100%. I think the trend was already happening. I think there was pushback. There's been pushback at the local levels, at the state level, and in institutions that are, you saw this with the lawsuits against Harvard in the last few years. That's long before the Trump victory, and they won. And the Supreme Court's been really good about this, sticking to the Constitution and equal rights rather than, the racism in elite education, where Asians have to have 200 points higher on their SAT scores, and it's just criminal that they got away with that. But so that started going away before the election, and I think that the big companies would have to move to a more sensible middle. Yeah, the election surely helped push that needle, and I'm glad to see it. I think it's just a return to common sense.
Definitely. I think that's a sentiment that from anyone that I've spoken to, there's so many people in the UK even who I would never have imagined would voted for Trump, and they were very almost anti him, but a lot of people were so saying that it just made sense, the sort of common sense
Yeah,
uh, approach, which seems to have left almost the Democratic Party. I was talking to a American somebody who works for the Democrats recently, and he said that the Democrat situation right now is quite troublesome. He gave quite
yeah,
a good assessment because he believes that a lot of the DEI, the wokeness, the sort of trans issues, the trans debate, gender ideology is so deeply entrenched in the Democratic Party. He's not sure if
yeah.
by the next election they actually have any shot of winning. Is that a fair assessment? And what do the Democrats do next? Because we've seen Obama, somebody who's 20 years ago, maybe a bit less, spoke about the importance of having secure borders. I don't
Yeah,
think he would be able to give a speech like that now.
yeah.
So what's going on in the Democrats? What's their next things?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if they're wise, they'll get away from these sort of litmus tests or these, these issue requirements that make it impossible for someone to think outside of the groupthink. And I think a great example of that was yesterday, or maybe it was this morning, Senator Fetterman from Pennsylvania, who was, when he ran for office in 22, he was considered a real progressive and a man of the left. And yet he's brought some real common sense to the conversation. And what he said was there's now 47 Democratic senators. You need 60 votes in the Senate to pass certain types of legislation. And so there's a bill that's been proposed to make it a crime, make it a requirement to deport an illegal migrant that's committed a crime. It seems pretty common sense. If you're here illegally, you've already broken the law. You're not a citizen. You don't have the protections of a citizen, and you came in the country illegally, and then you steal or do something even worse. Yeah, you should be deported. And what Fetterman said was, if I can't get 7 Democrats to vote for that, then that will point to the most obvious reason we lost the election in November. is that you're completely out of touch with the people and with common sense. And we had a vote in the Congress when the Republicans were in the majority, but there were 208, 215 or so Democrats in the Congress, and all of them voted, or all but one possibly voted against legislation that required uh, boys to not play in girls sports. It seemed like such a common sense thing. You don't have to be a person of the right or the left to understand that. Democrats have children, Democrats have girls that play in girls sports, and every Democrat voted against it. And that's an election loser. And I think so. Fetterman has a good point, that yeah, if they don't get their house in order on these requirements, these litmus tests, that the progressive left has just gone too far, and there has to be room for debate and different opinions in the party. And if they continue with this stuff, they'll continue to lose.
Is there much hope right now for the Democratic Party, though? Has there been talk of what they're going to do next? I know it's only recent
Yeah.
they've lost the election, but is there any talk of who's going to be the next leader, the next sort of plans for the future?
Yeah, I think, look, if they could do it all over again, in many ways they had an impossible task because of Biden being so weak, and with the cognitive issues. And I mean, there's so many things that went wrong with the Biden administration. And the most obvious is that he hung on too long and didn't pass the baton. And, if they'd had an open primary, it might have been different. But just so I don't overdo that, incumbents, really weak incumbent administrations, forget about Biden and his cognitive issues for a minute. Really weak administrations rarely remain in power. It's something, there is a great power to incumbency, but that's when things are going well in the country, or even just okay, not great, but not horrible. But, the right direction, wrong direction metric before the election was 25% right direction, 75 wrong. No incumbent president has ever won if their right direction number was below 30. So, this might be Monday. We call it Monday morning quarterbacking. What if we did this? What if we did that? I'm not sure anything would have worked because the conditions were so ripe for a Republican to win. And not just Donald Trump, but I think anybody. But what we have is they have an opportunity to course correct, to fix what's wrong. One of the big problems with any political party is that the people really in charge were just too old. Okay, you had a cognitively challenged president over 80. You've had Nancy Pelosi, who even when she retired as House Speaker was still the power in the party. She's the one who forced Biden out of the nomination process in July. And then you have Chuck Schumer, who's, if he's not 80, he looks 80. And so, as the leader of the Senate. And so those are really difficult. It's difficult for the generation to pass the baton, but if they were smart, they would. Look at Barack Obama. He was probably 45, 46 when he was elected in 2008. Bill Clinton was 44, 45 in 1992. JFK back in 1960. Even Jimmy Carter, who was a horrible president, he was in his low 50s, I believe, when he won. So, it's something that he's probably 51. So, they need to get younger, and then they need to get smarter. And I think there are a handful of governors who are sensible, and some are in a good position politically, like Newsom, Gavin Newsom in California, in terms of being very popular in his home state and being a pretty gifted politician. They talked about Gretchen Whitmer quite a bit, the governor of Michigan, who's attractive and younger, and won a couple, at least two elections, statewide elections in a relatively big state. But they are going to be attached to the progressive left. They were both big on lockdowns during COVID, so they might have some trouble. I think a newer common sense governor, like the governor of Kentucky, I forget his name, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. These are governors that I might consider them too liberal for my taste. I'm sure I would, but they're not radical progressive leftists. They're governors of states. Obviously Pennsylvania is a swing state, it swings right, swings left. You've got a Republican, one branch of the legislature is Republican now. Kentucky's a, a traditionally red state and reliably red state, and yet they have a Democrat governor. And so he's obviously someone who's common sense and isn't, a radical progressive leftist. So I think, there are some people that could do well. But I do think they're going to have to separate themselves from the real progressive wing. And they're also going to have to separate themselves from the Biden administration. And that's going to be harder for some than others. A governor can say, hey, I was just running my state. I wasn't involved in the reckless spending that created the inflation. I wasn't involved in the border. But I think a lot of them are on record for supporting what Biden was doing. And especially if you're a senator or a congressperson, that's going to be tough because you voted with him every time. And that, I think, is going to be challenging. So I think you need someone who can segregate themselves from the big blunders of the Biden years, which was wokeism, the open border, and of course, inflation. If you can do that, there's some young people that like Shapiro, and there's a chance that they can make it in national politics.
You mentioned it earlier and mentioned it a few times in terms of Biden's cognitive state. I think it was quite clear to everyone watching as neutral, regardless Democrat, Republican, the state of him. And there was even signs, I think, even in the 2020 build up to the
Oh
election
yeah,
where I saw scientists come out and publicly say that he's showing clear signs of whether it's early signs of dementia or just basic cognitive decline. And there was a really good stat on how he did one of the least amount of press engagements
oh yeah,
before the election. Even I think he almost let the BLM situation, the lockdowns, riots almost have its own impact, whereas he was almost didn't do much in terms of the press conferences.
yeah,
How did I think a lot of us in the UK just couldn't understand how did he get to that position where
yeah.
he became the leader of the Democrat Party and
Sure.
then president?
It's I mean, great question. They're going to write books about this. It was a phenomenal job of the power circle, the Democrat Party in Washington and across the country. It's a machine. They were a powerful machine. This is Nancy Pelosi, Schumer, the big donors. They so badly wanted to beat Trump. It was a very unifying force. They so badly wanted to beat Trump that they were willing to really ignore traditional democratic norms to do that. They kept ranting about, the Republicans are a threat to democracy and Trump is a threat. No, they literally took, they took Bernie Sanders out back and kicked him to the curb. Remember, Joe Biden lost Iowa. He came in fourth in New Hampshire. Maybe it was the other way around. You know, no Democrat president no Democrat has ever won the nomination without winning one or the other, and specifically Iowa. And yet Biden was made the candidate, and they did that by basically forcing the other candidates out and saying, "Look, Bernie Sanders is going to win this nomination, and he will lose to Trump by 10 points," which was pretty accurate. And again, this is before COVID, but so it was clearly going to be a terrible defeat for the Democrats. So they sort of worked around the nomination process. They got Jim Claiborne in South Carolina to endorse Biden, but that's only after basically negotiating with the other candidates for them to step aside. And so it just shows you the power of that inner circle and the lack of democracy in the party. And it's funny to say that now because it's always been something attached to the Republicans, which is absurd in itself. But I do think they did an incredible job of of working around his problems, and they covered it up. And I think that's the real important takeaway here is it wasn't just Biden's cognitive issues, and maybe he thought I'll be better staying in the basement and doing Zoom calls. He blamed it on COVID, of course, but that it's the people around him, the cover up, that is really a scandal here. Both the Democrat Party, especially the inner circle in the White House, as well as the media, who just completely collaborated with the scam. And it really was. It's a scandal, and I think there'll be many books, not just written about his nomination and his victory in 2020, but then the subsequent cover up in 21 and 22. By the time he had that debate on June 27th with Trump, which completely ended his nomination, or for the most part was the end of his nomination. It took 3 or 4 weeks to make it official, but um, and that was when people started dumping him, and they didn't dump him because of his cognitive challenges. They knew that all along. They knew it, and the only reason they dumped him is because the debate was so bad that he started polling, a good 5 points down to Trump in the swing states, and that's the reason they dumped him. And it's just scandalous. And I think good for some brave Democrats that came out. Dean Phillips, for example, he ran for president. He's a congressman from Minnesota, and he voted. I'm sure he voted along with Biden on everything, but he basically said, he's too old, and he was really criticized by the left. And then they got the same circle around Biden again in 24 that they did in 2020. They kept Dean Phillips and RFK Jr. off the ballot in North Carolina, in Florida. It's really scandalous, and they got away with it, and so they deserve to lose in many respects. And then when they kicked out Biden and they basically anointed Kamala as the candidate, same thing. They all denied that they'd ever covered up the Biden issues. They denied that Kamala was basically a failed vice president with virtually no relationship with Biden, and made her into this superstar. And it kind of worked for a few weeks. In late July and most of August, she was doing really well because they re-imaged her. They recreated this kind of new candidate, and the voters just aren't that stupid. She had a good few weeks, but the voters aren't done.
I thought when they were once it became clear Kamala was going to be the presidential candidate, I thought at one stage they may even Biden may step down and before the election, and
Yeah.
they get that buzz of Kamala being the first female president, and I thought that would maybe be one of their strategies.
I,
Being a bit cynical, I thought that may
yeah.
was going to happen.
No, I heard that kicked around, and I wouldn't put it past them, and because they'll do anything. They did it to Bernie
Yeah.
Sanders in 2016 when he was doing really well against Hillary, and they did it again in 2020. Um, and then in 24, it was the same kind of concept. They would do anything, and I wouldn't put it past them. Now, the funny thing is, they didn't do that. I think the excuse they would have said is, well, he's not in a condition to be president anymore. But I think there was some risk there for the party because there's so much evidence that his condition was failing as early as the 2020 election, and clearly had failed in 21 and 22, especially during the Afghanistan crisis, where he couldn't be reached. He couldn't have conversations with his defense team. These were really scandalous moments for the party. So in many ways, I think that might have been a step too far to make her the president.
Talking of scandals, corruption, in terms of, obviously there was a lot of that was levied at Donald Trump in his first time as
Yeah,
president. From me, just on the outside, now Republican and Democrat, just looking at the evidence base, there seems to be so much more towards Biden's 4 years, even
yeah,
him previously as VP. There's so much reports now. We're seeing, the laptop scandal, Hunter Biden, his son, all this sort of stuff. What if you could? I've heard you discuss this before. Give us a little general breakdown of some of the stuff that Biden has either been accused by, or just
yeah.
some stuff, the sort of corruption stuff around Joe
Yeah.
Biden.
I mean, I think the most obvious one, and there's many, but the most obvious one is the fact that he was involved in the influence peddling, directly involved in influence peddling when he was vice president. And again, sometimes it's the crime and sometimes it's the cover up. I think in this case, it's probably more the cover up, the fact that he was able to protect Hunter as long as he did, to make sure that the Justice Department, specifically the Attorney General, treated Hunter differently and carefully and gave him sweetheart deals and let the statute of limitations expire on so much of the crimes that Hunter committed. But and so that cover up is on Joe because he denied it. You remember in the debate in 2020, he outright lied to the American people and said, "I've never discussed my son's foreign business endeavors with him." And then of course 4 years later, the photos show up of him having dinner at Cafe Milano with any number of foreign influence buyers. And so the cover up has been really horrible. And then of course the pardoning Hunter after saying directly to the American people on many occasions that he would not pardon his son, and then to blame it on the Justice Department, which by the way was his Justice Department, and would do anything he told them to do, like prosecute President Trump. So the list is so long; it's hard to really pick. I mean, I guess it's easy to pick the biggest scandal, which is the influence peddling and then covering up for Hunter. But I do think you have some other ones that I think a more responsible media would have really pressed during those years. For example, working with the social media companies to censor information. That wasn't just something that happened by accident. They were on the phone with Facebook. They were on the phone with Twitter. Pre Elon Musk Twitter, asking them to censor information, not just about the Hunter Biden laptop, which in itself is a scandal, but also any COVID vaccine, mask mandates, any information that didn't fit the government line, they made sure didn't make the social media, and then of course the corporate media complied with that. So yeah, I think some of the stuff he did behind the scenes with the media companies, and that's just government coercion. That's a complete violation of free speech. And then you had a couple of other scandals. I think the student loan forgiveness, which again you can have that view. If you have a view that student loan borrowers are overwhelmed with debt and they can't pay it back and we should work something out. Okay, make that argument. Take it to Congress. Let's have the discussion. But what he did was unilaterally against the law, unconstitutional, and then continued to break the law after the Supreme Court said that is against the law and unconstitutional. So, and he bragged about it. And so, there's so many things that he did. I'm just ignoring the political mistakes, the policy mistakes of the spending in Afghanistan and the open border. Those are bad decisions that have horrible outcomes, but not necessarily scandalous. I mean, I could probably make an argument that they're scandalous, but I think the big one's going to be the influence peddling.
Do you think we'll ever get the full information on this, the full details? Will he get, in prosecuted afterwards? And the second thing is, where does Biden rank in terms of US presidents? I
I
think from
mean,
my living memory, he's definitely going to be the worst. But I've heard you say Jimmy Carter and other people have been not so good presidents. Where does Biden, maybe from yourself and then just general
yeah,
US perspective, where does he sit on the US presidency?
yeah. All right. First question, was about the details of all this corruption. I think it will come out. It's really hard to hide that stuff. They did it really well during the 2020 campaign. They kept it out of the media, or in the media, the mainstream media, the corporate media cooperated voluntarily, but surely the social media was coerced. That stuff will come out. I don't know. It's going to be hard to keep that. I mean, the FBI had the Hunter Biden laptop a year before it was exposed in October of 20, and they buried it. And that came out later, but those kind of things are really hard to bury. Like same with the Russia collusion hoax, which was an absolute scandal, and turned out to be fabricated by the Hillary Clinton campaign. Now that would have been good information in 2016, but it came out later. And same with Anthony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State. He was on the campaign in 2020, and he basically coordinated the hoax of the 51 former intelligence officials, really slandering themselves ultimately but perjuring themselves by signing a letter that said the laptop is Russian disinformation. The FBI already knew it was real, and then of course the media all admitted it, but only after the election was over. So that I think all of that will come out especially if the media starts doing their job. As far as the ranking Biden, I won't do it on all American presidents because you can make some arguments about Andrew Johnson in 1864. It's probably worth just considering modern presidents or 20th and 21st century. I don't think there's a doubt that Biden will go down as the worst. And I think you've probably heard me say that comparisons to Jimmy Carter are an insult to Jimmy Carter. Now, I didn't love Jimmy Carter. I'd probably make a credible argument that he's the second or third worst president, surely after the war. But he did some good things, and he was actually a decent man in many respects. And so I don't think it's not even close. It's not even close. And I think I won't get into all the details comparing the presidents. We could do an entire hour on that. But I guess I'll just pick the top one, which is Jimmy Carter had mismanaged a lot in his administration. He didn't handle inflation well. He didn't handle Iran well at all. He didn't handle the Soviets well. He didn't handle the economy. But for the most part, he meant well. And he also inherited a lot of those problems. I think that the revolution in Iran was probably bubbling for a while. I don't know that anyone could have saved the Shah. It's a shame that Jimmy Carter pulled the rug from under him, but would that last another 10 years or another generation? I don't know. The Soviets were misbehaving long before Jimmy Carter took over. That was the whole concept of détente, which was this kind of let's all get along idea with the Soviets. That was started by Richard Nixon, and so Jimmy Carter continued it, and he made mistakes. He was very much, guilty of appeasement to both Iran and to the Soviet Union. Funny enough, we have a president right now guilty of the same two things. And then you had, of course, inflation. But the difference is Jimmy Carter didn't cause those things. He didn't handle them well, but he didn't cause them. Joe Biden caused the inflation. Joe Biden purposely opened the border. Joe Biden appeased the Russians. He appeased Iran. It's absolutely shameless that he created these problems, and so I think you can assign a lot more blame to Biden because again, Jimmy Carter was dealt a bad hand, and Biden was dealt a very good hand.
Jimmy Carter's obviously a lot before my time and some of our listeners' time, but from reading, there seemed another similarity. It seems to resonate with the pair of them is the decline of America
Yeah.
on the world stage. It definitely seems the last 4 years America hasn't been the America that we know it as and how we've seen it in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And so it
Yeah.
seems to be very similar between the two. Do you think now with Trump, well, it already seems that there's a massive improvement in the US on the world stage. I think
Yeah.
the key thing that everyone's going to be discussing, I'm sure, is Russia, Ukraine, firstly. Um, how confident are you that that conflict will be solved? I know there's already Zelensky's already seen be more open about
Yeah.
that change, and I've
Yeah.
heard from people that some people are saying that they think the deal's already done, that the
Yeah,
conflict will be
that would
over.
be great if it was. I mean, I think that the challenge is I totally respect what President Trump has in mind. He wants to end the war, and there's going to be unhappy players on both sides. The biggest concern or the biggest wild card is Putin. I think, as you mentioned, Zelensky's already sort of expressed some level of cooperation and willingness to sit down. I'm not sure that we're going to get that from Putin. In many ways, you can't turn back the clock. This is what we have. When Trump was president, he sent lethal weapons in initially Javelin missiles to Ukraine. That's after 8 years of Obama Biden sending blankets and meals ready to eat to American Air Base in Poland and then trucking them in commercial trucks to Kyiv because they didn't want to offend Putin. They didn't want to, they were so afraid of him and they obviously appeased Iran and gave them piles of cash in the JCPOA in 2015, which enabled them to behave badly. They gave them money to fund the proxies and around the Middle East. And then Trump came in and basically shut Iran down, killed Soleimani when he felt it was important to do that. He made sure that the mullahs weren't winning with high oil prices and the ability to sell oil to anybody they wanted to. And so, the Iran was sort of, or the mullahs were really down and out by the time the administrations changed in early 21. And yet, the first thing Biden does, one of the first things he did was take the Houthis off the terrorist list, end the embargo and end the embargo on Iran and the sanctions. He took Nord Stream 2 off the sanctions list that Trump had put them on. I mean, he just reversed every common sense foreign policy move. And surely it made America weaker. And then, of course, the debacle in Afghanistan was just basically sent a message to the world that we're not going to fight back. We're going to be passive and we're going to appease. And that's why Putin invaded Ukraine. That's why the mullahs started behaving really badly with money that Biden basically gave them on some accounts, and then on others he allowed them to make a lot more money. People forget also that Biden was really, at the same time, he was very accommodating to the energy sector in Russia by taking Nord Stream off the sanctions list. Again, put them back on later, but too late. And allowing the mullahs to sell oil, and their oil sales went from 500,000 barrels a day to 3 or 4 million barrels a day because of Biden, but also Biden's hostility to our own energy sector enabled prices to go up. And what it annoys me when I see people blame the invasion of Ukraine for the elevation of oil prices. Yes, they did go up after the invasion, and natural gas prices, of course, but they were up 60% from when Biden took office because he shut down the Keystone Pipeline. He stopped giving oil leases to energy producers in America. He basically did his best to be extremely hostile to the energy sector, and at the same time was very good to the energy sector in Iran and Russia, and for that matter, Venezuela. And you had higher prices because the US had become the swing price. And so, oil and natural gas go up 60%. That means the mullahs and Putin were selling oil and gas at much higher prices than they were, when Trump was president. And look what that enabled them to do. It's really scandalous to see that he was hostile to his own people, his own energy sector. And then, of course, before Russia invaded Ukraine, he sent Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor for Biden. He sent Jake to Moscow to beg Putin to pump more oil. And then, Biden himself humiliated himself and the country by going to Riyadh to ask MBS to pump more oil. And, good for MBS for telling him no, because the smartest thing that Americans can do is pump more oil and natural gas. That brings prices down, not just for Americans, but for the world markets. And so it's better for our allies. It's better for the world. So yeah, he's a long list of mistakes. But what worries me about Biden and his legacy is there weren't just mistakes. He did it on purpose. He wanted oil prices to be higher. He wanted inflation. He wanted the border open. And you can argue that appeasing our enemies was a mistake, but I could also argue that he did it on purpose.
It's interesting because you talk about the energy, and I've heard so many people, mainly a lot in America, who've said that one of the most important things going forward is being energy independent. It's now
Yeah.
the next wars are going to be on energy, and it seems crazy what Biden's done in terms of the energy market in the States and what he's done to them. Trump was so successful. We're talking sort of on foreign affairs in his first term. I think there's cases for him, to be honest, to almost win a Nobel Peace Prize. What he did with the Abraham Accords,
Yeah.
incredible. Middle
Yeah.
East, stopping the Russia-Ukraine, no aggravation there. China looking at Taiwan. Do you think he can have the same success in foreign affairs this time? Because the argument you could make the world maybe is a bit more chaotic than
Yeah,
when he was in 2016 when we first came in, whereas now it seems a lot more like on fire. Do you think he can have the same level of success?
I mean, impossible to say. I think the answer is yes, because the world is a lot messier and difficult and violent than it was when he handed over the reins in 4 years ago. So the accomplishments will be that much greater if he could get back on track with the Abraham Accords, which I think he can, do a deal with the Saudis or between the Saudis and the Israelis, which I think he can. So it'll be probably more dramatic. But yeah, I have to manage expectations because he's inheriting a much more difficult world than Biden inherited. And again, it goes back to my comparison to Carter. I mean, Biden inherited a world with peace and prosperity, and he wrecked it. And whereas Carter inherited a difficult world. It was a bad time for American leadership. That had started that kind of a weakened America. That started with Nixon and Gerald Ford. Definitely, the tail end of Nixon with Watergate, and and then Gerald Ford was sort of a lame duck because after Watergate, there's no way a Republican could have won. But it's really important to highlight that Biden caused all of this stuff, and now Trump is going to have to clean it up. He's going to have to. We've got $10 trillion more in debt. When Trump passed the baton, it was 25 trillion. Now it's 36 trillion. Interest rates are 2 times what they were when Trump left. So you have a much more difficult challenge because not only are you paying interest on more debt, 33% more debt, but you're paying the interest at double the interest rate. It's $1 trillion a year. It's more than we spend on defense and security. So these are big problems that Trump is going to have to deal with. And they weren't created, by him, but he still has to deal with it. So, and then I think, with foreign policy, you have a real, difficult world right now. Now, maybe that means, his victory or his is more important. He can be more of the savior, and that's maybe some upside there politically. But I do think we should thank the Israelis for doing what they've done the last 6 months because it would have been really messy to inherit that conflict in sort of early 23 or even late 20 or no, it wouldn't have been early 20 to inherit the world after October 7th. That first 6 to 12 months after October 7th, that would have been a real mess. And it's not that Biden showed any leadership. It's just that the Israelis did. The Israelis ignored him when he threatened them, and they've really cleaned up all three situations with the Houthis, with Hezbollah as well as Hamas, and even Iran itself. So I think they've done a great job. So in the Middle East, I think Trump's inheriting a more difficult situation than he left in 2020, but it's a lot better than it was a year ago. Ukraine and Russia, that's going to be tricky because of Putin.
Well, I think one of the things that's quite clear that will probably be discussed quite a lot in as soon as Trump, I almost think, inaugurated, will probably be the Trump successor. I think we're hearing about it already in terms of people, little discussions in Europe, but in terms of it would be um, is there any inclination right now, and do you see that being a really big topic in the US media? Because it seems we heard it in the build-up to election. Will he run again? Will he
Yeah.
revoke the constitution? It seemed, and I can just imagine the moment he gets elected, that will be one of the things mainstream media does is constantly press him in terms of is he going to revoke the constitution so he can run again? And
Yeah. I,
do you see that reoccurring? And
well,
any ideas on who that person could be?
I think the part about President Trump, like it would be pretty funny if he threw that out there. I think he would do it just to mess with the media and just to mess with the left. I mean, it would be entertaining to see the absolute insanity that you'd get from the corporate media and the left. Um, Obviously, he wouldn't be serious about it. He's almost 79, I think. So he himself, it would be really a shock if he
Yeah.
even suggests that. But no, it's clear, I think it's clear that in picking JD Vance, he was in some ways picking a successor
Yeah.
because there probably would have been better candidates politically in the near term, from an electoral perspective, for sure. He could have picked someone in a different lane that might, pick up. He was never going to pick Nikki Haley, but you could look at a Glenn Youngkin who, is a private equity guy, Wall Street guy, governor of a swing state in Virginia, or almost a swing state. That there were some merits to the other potentials, and yet he picked a guy who's a lot like him, politically in the same lane, that populist, Trumpian lane, and only a senator for 2 years, very young. Now that can be a good thing, but also a negative. And, that was a bit of a risk. And I think some of us were surprised when he chose J.D. Vance. But two things. One is J.D. Vance has surprised everybody who didn't really know him, including me. I of course, knew who he was, but I had not followed him. I'd never met him. He crushed it on the campaign trail. He's handled himself really well. And I think I could argue he's in the pole position for, being the heir to Trump. And, definitely, I'd rather be in his seat than anyone else's in terms of running in 2028. It's a little early. I think, the presidential cycles seem to keep getting longer, right? Trump probably set the record for announcing, and well, maybe not the record, but he was early, December of 22. That's a full 2 years before the election. Um, I don't think you'll start to see a lot of chatter until the midterms. And so, but I think the day after the midterms in 2026, you'll see positioning, you'll see people talking about it quite a bit. JD for sure, Ron DeSantis, who I think is fantastic. I think you'll see other sort of new Republicans, that are not the old country club Republican. You see the more populist right, like DeSantis and like JD. I don't think you'll have it. Someone will run, but I don't think they have a chance of bringing the party back to the old Bush, McCain, Romney, centrist, moderate. It's not going to happen. I just think that the party has changed too much. And it's not 100% Trump. This started back in 2009 with the Tea Party movement, which was a real grassroots rejection of Obama tax and spend politics, where government they felt government was getting too big. Now, little did we know that Biden would run circles around Obama in terms of making government too big and taxing and spending. But I don't think there's a return to the old country club Republican, because again, it's now like 15 years where people have rejected it. Trump came on about 5 years into that grassroots Tea Party movement, and took advantage of it in some ways, but also really understood the people and the kind of rejection of big government progressive. The problem is that progressive wing is powerful, and that's one of the reasons we lost the election in 2020. There's a lot of things that lined up. It was in many ways a perfect storm, but they know how to win elections and they know how to get votes. And so many times Republicans win the argument, but they don't win the election. And I think these guys get that now. So I think you could see another 8 years after Trump if no major mistakes are made.
I think from everything that I've heard from people, it just seems almost not inevitable. Obviously, a lot can go wrong, but it just seems so much lack of stuff coming from the Democrats, the mess that they're in, and somebody like JD Vance, who, like you said, has just been so impressive. Everything I've
Yeah.
listened to him and anything I've heard from, again, people say it's just been so positive. And I think he's handled. I know there's the massive HB1 debate with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk and all this. I think I listened to him not directly talk about that, but he talked a lot about the importance for like cultural identity, the national, gave a much more holistic thing rather than just economic migrant, if you like. And he,
Yeah.
I thought, absolutely smashed it out of the park. So
Yeah, I mean,
very
look,
exciting.
I love the fact that, I mean, he articulates the message so much better than many of us do, and I think he does it better than President Trump. But
Mm.
I don't agree with him on everything, but I do think it's really refreshing to have some new views, that aren't just straight down the middle. Okay, cut taxes, cut spending. I mean, those are good things. Don't get me wrong, but he and people like Tulsi Gabbard have brought some, sort of a new intellectual curiosity of let's not do things the way we've always done them because it's always worked out. America's the most powerful country in the world. We have the most powerful military ever assembled. Let's go in and change the government in Iraq, or let's go in and change the government in Afghanistan. And I think that younger generation understands, and they're the ones who fought those wars. They understand that that's not necessarily the smartest thing to do. Is you can demonstrate power, or you can exhibit power. I mean, I love this argument, of peace through strength. That's not new. That was Ronald Reagan's line. So I think there's a really great combination of new and old, where the old, basics, the core fundamental values that are American values and conservative values, which are, peace through strength, let the people, give people the freedom to and the liberty to provide for themselves and their families. That's just core Republican conservative values. But there's a new twist to it where I think, the J.D. Vances of the world can articulate a message that, that works, but it might not work for everybody, especially if your town has been basically abandoned by a big factory that moved to China, right? So, these are new problems that I didn't have to grow up with, but they're things that I think the younger generation can articulate much better than someone like me.
Part of me would like almost that constitution part where the president can't do 2 terms to almost get torn apart, because I'd love to see a Trump versus Obama potential.
It would be
That'd be
great.
a crazy.
Unfortunately, there's one thing we can't solve for, Sunir, which is age, and
That's
it,
true.
it's just it is what it is, and we saw it with Biden. But I also, and look, President Trump looks like he's in great condition. He actually, to me, at least, seems more energetic, or maybe it's just the
Yeah.
people around him are doing more. But I'm not worried about his cognitive issues at all. But he is, pushing 80, and it's, some people can crush it until they're 90, and some people start to fade when they're 70. It's not my world, but I do think one really important thing to remember is with Biden is, yeah, it's scandalous and almost criminal what they did in the cover up, but his cognitive issues were not the worst part about his presidency. The worst part about his presidency were the decisions he made, and I'm sure he was quite coherent when he made them, to ignore the issues in Afghanistan and let those poor kids die, to purposely open the border without any regard for the people living in the country, and the crime that came from it and the death that came from it, and purposely blowing out the budget and spending, $10 trillion more than he should have on reckless, reckless spending. Those things are the real legacy of the Biden administration. Most people someday might just remember the June 27th debate or his cognitive challenges, but it's the cover up that was scandalous. But I think the real disaster of these years has been, the foreign policy appeasement, the wrecking of the economy, the negative wage growth. People's wages went down 2.5% in America. That's unthinkable. It's just, I know there's good times and bad, but in the bad times, incomes are flat. In the good times, they go up, 2%, 4% a year, like they did with Trump. Yeah, 8% in 4 years, minus 2.5%, caused by his own reckless spending. And all that money was borrowed, and we're going to have to pay it back now. So I hope that people remember how bad Biden was, not because of his cognitive issues, but because of the decisions and the policies that he made.
I think that's a good sort of way to sort of wrap things up. I mean, it's been great to have you on. We have like a closing sort of tradition on the show where
Yeah.
essentially I asked the guest, what is a unpopular opinion that you have that you think should be popular? So it can be something that we've talked about already on this show. It could be something completely trivial. But essentially, what does Greg think is an unpopular opinion that should be popular?
Yeah, an unpopular opinion. Let me think about that. I hope you can edit out this 60 seconds of searching. Um, yeah, I mean, economics, foreign policy.
It can be.
I got this. I got this. And it's kind of cheating because the trend is already my friend here, and the wind's blowing my way. But net zero and the obsession with climate change is still popular, especially among young people, and it will become very unpopular. It already has started. The voters are starting to reject that. Just look at Germany. So that's something that, let me do the reverse on that. The liberation of the energy sector has not been very popular for the last 10 years, since the Paris Accords in 15. That is over. It's done. You are going to see that dumped on day one. If you want to build sustainable, non-carbon energy sources, people go ahead. If it works and it's practical and it's affordable, great. Love hydro, love nuclear, love, biomass to energy, all sensible, but it's got to be what's good for the people and what's good for business. And that whole obsession with net zero, it's going to hang around here in the UK, unfortunately, for 4.5 more years. But that's got to be dropped.
Perfect. I think that's a really good one, and yeah, hopefully the Trump administration. I think hopefully we can almost take inspiration from
Yeah,
the
you
Trump
can.
administration. And I
And
know a lot of this podcast has been very pro-Trump, but I think it is the general sentiment. I think for a lot of people in the UK, is a strong America is
of
great for the
course,
UK. It's great for the West. It's great for the
it's
world. So I think
fantastic.
the sooner we see that strong America again, then the better. Greg, it's been amazing having you
Yeah,
on. Thank you for coming.
great to talk to you. And tell me, like, if you want to mute it, that's fine.